Welcome to a special Biota podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today, 2 bits of audio from a recent conference at NASA Ames hosted by Biota's own Bruce Damer. The first is a series of questions to Will Wright of SimCity, SimEarth, Sims, and soon-to-be Spore fame. And I was going to include his presentation, however there are a number of technical difficulties relating to his presentation's audio. It also is pretty accurately represented in the various Google videos of Will Wright giving Spore presentations, and he makes a number of references to what's going on the screen, which never really works particularly well in an audio podcast. However, the questions are new information, and it's something which I think is particularly interesting and relevant to the discussion associated with artificial life. The first question comes from Rudy Rucker, who ironically is also the speaker of the second part of the audio in this evening's podcast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the question series from Will Wright. Unfortunately, I think 2 of the questions were missed due to background noise and various other problems, and some of the questions that I'm putting in the podcast still are a little garbled. So wherever I have done an actual edit, I will put a 1-second silence just to indicate that the audio has been edited at that point, and then move very quickly into Rudy's lecture. Now, Rudy suffers technical difficulties initially, so I'll cut the discussion associated with technical difficulties, and I think his discussion, whilst it touches on a number of areas as Will Wright's questions touch on as well, they all have some vening into the broader artificial life discussion that has gone on in the Biota podcast to date. I will start now with Rudy's question.
I have one question, of course. Somebody told me this at the Game Developers Conference a couple of years ago, so how soon can we get it? and the other, I know you have an interest in artificial life, and I was wondering, are you planning to have any sort of non-player characters in here that are sort of evolving on their own?
Well, when you're playing, I can show you the evolution game. When you're playing the evolution game, you were playing as one species, and you control the evolution of that species. Every time you mate, you go back in the under, you get a few points to spend on upgrading your creature, and then you go back and you have to live and eat and survive. Other creatures are trying to eat you, or they might be friendly. In some sense, we're controlling the external evolution of your opponents. But we're doing it because of brute force. By pulling from the database, we're going to have millions and millions of creatures that we can pull from and basically interpolate between those to evolve your opponents. In some sense, it's kind of ironic because you, as the player, are doing intelligent design. You're not even doing evolution. You're actually an intelligent designer when you're designing what your creature will be like. So you're not actually simulating evolution in that sense. Well, we are kind of simulating the evolutionary system around you. But as you know, to really simulate evolution, in a real way, you need, very large populations in thousands of generations. It's not something that you can get with a few hundred over 10 generations.
So you're sort of shortcutting it time.
Yeah. So we're actually trying to illustrate evolution in the most fun way possible, because to really simulate evolution, you're having to deal with such large statistical data sets that any kind of player involvement or empathy or connection to these things becomes totally removed.
This is a comment here. I'm writing a book chapter for a scientific book about intelligent design, creationism versus evolution, and we have authors who, there's a Vatican cardinal writing, and rabbis and whatnot, and proponents of one side or the other, and I'm writing the chapter on artificial life, and I'm covering Spore as an example of an intelligent design type metaphor versus the Carl Sims, Tom Ray kind of turn it on and let it go on its own and come back after 3 weeks and see what's there.
Right.
So it's interesting that you're confirming I made the right choices.
Even like in the Carl Sims or Tom Ray type system, they're the ones designing the fitness steps, right?
Right.
So now they're directly specifying it one step removed.
Right, exactly right. So artificial life definitely is a lightning rod, of our generation. Fascinating field.
Hi, Will. I'll try to make this question fast. I just Googled to double-check my facts. We are, in fact, the last in the nation in science in California. I thought it was 46. We're actually 50th in the nation. 10 years ago, I made the argument to our principal that I would be allowed to buy a SimCity and run it in our high school media lab. She let me do it for a couple of hours a week, and the kids said, wow, we are learning by inference what this is about. So the question is, given our inferiority in science, technology, engineering, and math, what I'm seeing behind this is physics, genetics, atmospheric chemistry. Is there anything that the teachers of tomorrow can do to say, okay, you're playing this thing, but let's be explicit about the science, technology, and so forth underneath it? Are you going to do any of those educational extensions?
Well, first of all, I want to have the manual cover basically jumping points for the kids if they get interested. This covers a lot of, as I mentioned, pretty wide range of scientific disciplines. And really, as I said at the beginning, at the outset, what I really want to do is motivate kids to get interested in these fields. I'm not especially concerned with downloading the right facts for them from the game, because every kid in essence has the Library of Congress on their desktop right now, but they're just not using it. But if you can motivate them to get interested in that subject, and also how cool it is, they'll pull it out. And if they're pulling it, it's so much more powerful when you're pushing it on them. What I've found is that when people play these games, SimCity or whatever, at some point they start coming back and arguing about the assumptions that I put in the simulation. And to me, that's the win state. The point at which they start realizing that this is a model, it's not reality. They have a separate model of reality. This model helps crystallize their internal model. To the point where they can say, the exceptions they have with that model. That's not the way I think the world works. I think the way it works this way. I think the model has been successful, and crystallizing their internal model. So when they come back and argue, about the assumptions of the model, I think that's great. I think there's a whole kind of brand of modeling where you want the assumptions underneath to be transparent. But of course, any simulation is nothing but a set of assumptions. So it's not like you can really neutralize any set of assumptions within a model. That's why I'm more concerned with making those assumptions and then rule set that we're trying to discover back in the prototyping phase. I'm really concerned with making that interesting, fun, and engaging so that they do get motivated. Because if they never get motivated, all the rest of it is for naught, right? So that's my first and foremost priority, is get them motivated and interested to where they spend 10 hours, 20 hours playing with this, and then they start arguing about how screwy the assumptions were and how we're full of it for assuming this, that, and the other. But one of my old favorite quotes was that education is not the filling of a pail, but sparking of a fire. And you see that so clearly with computer games that sometimes, they're not just games too. Kids, when they get interested in the subject, there's usually like something, maybe it's a movie they saw, a play they played with, a friend of theirs that introduced them to something that they just get totally obsessed with, and a lot of times it'll end up being Pokemon or whatever, and parents see this all the time. And I think these games have the power to connect them to things in the real world that are relevant, that will serve them for the rest of their life. They're just not always being used that way.
I got turned on to artificial life by having an ant farm as an 8-year-old.
Oh, yeah. Ants, yeah, Rudy will tell you about ants.
Rudy will tell you. Next question.
Two questions. I was wondering if you are thinking at all about developing APIs for people to extend the functionality that you put into the game. And I was also curious, in terms of the architecture, it sounds like this is going to be a centralized hosting model, the content being hosted by the company. I'm wondering if somebody like NASA wanted to, make lots of data accessible to bring into the game, something like that would be possible.
Well, we're actually working with our fan sense right now, which has been a great resource for ways that they have access to our database for aggregation and stuff. Again, the data for this stuff is basically trivial. Those creatures in the UFO and stuff I showed you, in computer memory with the full mesh and texture, they're between 2 to 4 megabytes, which is really typical for a computer model. But they all compress down to about 10 or 20K of data. So each one of these compresses down to a very small genome. And that's what we're actually sending back and forth across the net. So we're going to be providing this for the game players with no subscription or anything, because the amount of data that we're actually sending back and forth is trivial. In fact, we just embedded in the JPEG thumbnail. The genome for everything is embedded in the thumbnail. So we're hoping that fan sites will have easy ways to access our database and also aggregate this stuff on their own. You can also run the game without being on the net at all, because this stuff compresses so small. We can on disk provide a database of 10,000 features in a very small footprint. But yeah, we're not against that at all. In terms of the API for connecting to the game systems, these systems are so tightly integrated and highly engineered. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it would be a huge amount of work. And so that would probably depend on exactly kind of what the initiative was. In some of our older games, we've done that before for universities that are doing things like AI research or whatever. For the games that were way back, just a few months ago, I got Electronic Arts to open source the original SimCity for the OLPC project, the One Red Copper Child. So that's now available for free, open source, so kids can actually go into the simulation, rewrite it, customize it, learn from it, whatever. So that's something that we'd like to see our industry do more often, is use some of the older games that we're not really making money from anyway, hand them over to the community, and let kids kind of use them and kind of take them where they want.
Questions?
So, if I might ask, what did you put in the bin for Spore 2?
Sorry to ask that. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. Obviously, when you're dealing with a game about the universe, you can put a lot into it. As I was mentioning about, we want to release the picture editor first, and then support the PC game. We're actually looking at a lot of other ways that we can take these tools, the leverage from these tools off into totally different directions. We got one of those 3D printers in our office, which are colored now, by the way. They print out 3D color models. And now we can export anything from the game and just print it out. So we have all these printouts of creatures and vehicles and whatnot. That's a really cool direction. Obviously we can do things like trading cards. There's just a lot of different directions that this could go to where it's not just a PC game, but it's kind of more, in game terms, a franchise. But I would like to imagine something that's kind of like Pokemon, but an educational franchise, where kids are kind of more connected to real issues, science, stuff like that. I'd say there are kind of directions we can expand this kind of in the PC space, like Spore 2.0 on the PC. I can think of a lot of things that I would want to add to it. But Spore as a franchise, in terms of what are the other ways in which this can become kind of an identity or brand that is a kind of a fun take on the universe and evolution and biology. I think that probably interests me more than what Spore 2.0 the PC game is going to become. I'm more interested in kind of getting out of the box in the world.
Just curious, what was the budget?
We're north of 30 million at this point. Which I know sounds like a high number. Well, game development, that's actually almost reasonable in game development nowadays. Game budgets have skyrocketed, pretty similar to mid-level film budgets at this point. We actually did this with a team that was about half the size of what's typically done for AAA titles now. Because of the fact that everything in the game is procedural, most game teams right now, over half the team is content. Artists making models, doing textures, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to doing, our art procedurally, all the planets, creatures, buildings, about half of the music is procedural as well. Depending on, when you're creating a creature, that creature is actually generating a unique thing. We work with Brian Eno, who's doing our soundtrack, and he's done a lot of work with procedural music. And he never really had a format for it because he can't really sell procedural music on a CD. And so, he was been kind of frustrated. He loved doing procedural music, but there was no format, except games are like the perfect format for him. So, and we actually have like little tools when you design your city. You get a little musical tool where you can actually regenerate new music within the city based upon his algorithms.
So how many people are on the team?
About 100. Yeah.
I keep asking questions.
Your comment about Brian Eno makes me think about the interplay between creativity, artistic creativity, and scientific creativity, and the way that you are invoking creativity in the game that you're creating.
Yeah.
And just how, I guess maybe if you could just talk a bit more about the thought process that went into inspiring people to be creative. I mean, that's such a big part of what you're creating here.
Yeah, I think the underlying thread to what you're saying is that it's actually amazing how very simple things, when they come together, can make surprising elaborate results, depending on how you mix them. And this is kind of generally referred to as emergence. In computer terms, it's emergence. Very simple rules can emerge into very complex behavior. The same is actually true in some sense of art, music, and the tools that we're giving the players here. We want to give them the simplest set of tools that, when combined, give them the widest set of possibilities in space that they're dealing with. So there's this kind of ratio. How simple can the tool be? How many levers can I hand you that you can, by manipulating, create the widest variety of interesting things? And that's kind of an interesting caveat, because it's easy to build a generative system that fills your screen with static, and every setting of the valve is going to be a different static screen, and they're all different, but they're not interestingly different. And so a lot of what we do in engineering these systems is try to constrain the output space to stuff that, depending on the format, is something that's aesthetically or functionally interesting. But give you the simple, almost somewhat a mapping too, as to what this lever is causing. As you move this lever back and forth, you want to see, some obvious kind of connection with the output between the genotype and the phenotype. So, and that's something it's not easily engineered, and it's really more almost of a discovery process, which again is why we spend so much time prototyping. And even though we're going to throw away, 190 of those 200 prototypes, that was extremely valuable.
So you, at the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned education and your experience in the education system before you were 6th grade and after 6th grade in Montessori, you said. How do you see tools like this playing a role in what we consider formal education for people?
It's tricky in the world of standardized testing because in games and the type of things that they teach tend to by their very nature resist standardized testing. Any game in essence is... What's that?
Maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it is actually. Every game that you buy really is a problem. You're selling somebody paying you $50 to give them a problem. You say, here, solve this problem. Hopefully the problem's interesting and they can apply some creativity to it. But really, games are about problem solving. Whether it's shooting all the guys in that army or building a thriving civilization, the player then the question is kind of like, how big is the solution space? Most games have a very constrained, very rigid solution space where there's one way to rescue the princess. I'm much more interested in games that have a very wide solution space, so there's a million ways to do it correctly. And that way the players will be much more creative by where they fall in that solution space, and drives me toward kind of more emergent systems that can generate a larger solution space. But it's also really interesting when you put your typical 12-year-old in front of something like this that has a million knobs and buttons and all these possibilities. They just start banging buttons, observing what's happening, and they intuit the rules of the system in the simulation. It's amazing how quickly a 12-year-old can build a mental model from a complex simulation just by sitting there and pressing buttons on their Xbox. Typically you hand that to an adult over 40, and they want to read the manual. They want to know what to do. They want to know, they don't want to fail, And kids embrace failure-based learning. Adults avoid it like the plague. But in essence, kids are practicing the scientific method, right? They sit there, they experiment, they look at the result, they try to build a model in their head, they hypothesize about what the underlying model is, test that with a new experiment, and continually refine that kernel model. And so kids are very naturally born toward the scientific instinct, and games are probably the one environment where they really get to practice and refine the scientific method, using the scientific method. And I think, in our culture, both parents and a lot of educators don't recognize that as such. They just kind of, games are about the same as drugs. All my kids playing games, too bad, he's addicted. But yeah, and that's an unfortunate kind of cultural position that we're in right now.
One interesting point Tom Cochran mentioned earlier, that he was very impacted by SimCity. So in a sense, your earlier creations like SimCity created a sort of SimCity generation of engineers who want to do large-scale visual simulation. I'm wondering in 15, 20 years what kind of scientific and engineering creative minds will have been the Spore generation.
Oh, yeah. I think SimCity, the core of that was systemic thinking. Usually when people look at a city, they would analyze the traffic patterns or the, industrial pollution or whatever. They wouldn't look at the whole thing as one complete system, it's an organic system. I think Spore is going, it has a lot of that under the hood, but it's almost, the essence of Spore is more about the fact that all these systems can be very creative, high leverage, anybody can come in, make a very imaginative world. It still has simulation pushing back on it, but at the same time, there's a lot of artistic expression within that solution space that the simulation is kind of constraining you in. So you can find a solution that fits the simulation, but at the same time, still be very unique in kind of a different dimension.
All right, Brett, probably have enough.
How are we on time?
Well, we were scheduled to finish at 2:15.
Oh, okay.
It's Margaret Corbett.
Which is a question.
Oh, Margaret's there. So I think we have a couple more minutes.
If there's a question over there.
A question up here.
I just wanted to follow up on Stephanie's question, which is, follow up on Stephanie's question, which is, you let them bend the science rules, but how much? I mean, and you're thinking about how to design these things. Obviously, you assume warp 10 or something like that, or you don't worry about how long it takes to get there. But when you're building your planet, how tall can a tree be in heavy atmosphere and heavy gravity versus light gravity, so on and so forth.
This is a toy world, and as such, it's more important that it has consistent rules than those rules exactly match our rules, the rules of reality. So, for instance, we have, kind of climate in terms of if the atmospheric pressure were to go way up, we'd start getting global warming and sea levels would rise here. That's kind of part of this simple little model that once kids kind of learn and understand that, they can kind of work around it. They're building a model of this system. And they, I think you understand whenever you see a caricature or a comic book or anything, that it's a representation of reality. And, Charlie Brown doesn't look like a real boy, because he's an artistic representation. So I think it's more important that they understand this is a toy simulation, toy model, and they're trying to intuit and understand, reverse engineer the rules of this model, which is a simplified representation of reality. That's what models really are. That's what a map is. If I hand you a map, it doesn't look anything like the city, but it removes a huge amount of detail, and it's an abstract representation for a very specific purpose.
Okay, but you do try to be internally consistent.
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, that would be really frustrating if the rules of the game were basically stochastic, we're changing underneath me all the time. And I'm building a model, and it's correct 1 minute, and incorrect the next. Yeah, so we definitely don't want that. So we should probably call time at this point.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.
Valley in 1986 to teach computer science at San Jose State University, and has also worked at Autodesk. He's published 29 books, including nonfiction popular science books on topics such as relativity, infinity, the fourth dimension, and information. His latest book, The Life Box, the Seashell, and the Soul, is about the meaning of computation. So it is my pleasure to introduce Rudy Rucker, whose talk is called Life After the Orphanet, and I'm sure he can tell us exactly what that means.
I get sort of tired of doing PowerPoint, so I decided to put my talk on my blog. So you can follow along if you go to rudyrucker.com/blog. But it doesn't show up that well on the projector, so I made an HTML version. And I started out as a math professor in Silicon Valley, and was teaching computer science at San Jose State, and I got a job at Autodesk because John Walker befriended me. He liked my science fiction. He was one of the founders, and we were doing cellular automata together. And then I got involved in cyberspace, and there's a project called Autodesk Cyberspace, and it was trying to be a sort of proprietary source to make these 3D worlds that we see everywhere now in computer games and in Second Life. And I wrote a novel about that. It's called The Hacker and the Ants. And the main villain in the book was John Walker, which he's a friend of mine, so I thought this was funny. But in there, the ants escape and get into reality. So it's a case where we have virtual reality invading real reality, in the sense that these were viruses that got into the high-definition televisions. Every TV set in the world has this monster chip in it now to process all the data. And I was imagining a virus, an artificial life form that wanted to live in the TV sets. And of course, the character was charged with treason for destroying a national resource. Here's a little painting of the hacker and the ant. And one of the things about VR, things like Second Life, I've never really related to those types of virtual reality, where it's sort of an empty room with a lot of polygons. I don't know. There's teenagers wearing masks, and they don't talk to me. Just not my bag. So if I do VR, I like to see something that's... I started as a mathematician. I like to see something that I wouldn't be able to see otherwise. And one thing I've used VR for a little bit is looking into four-dimensional worlds. And I had my grad students do some projects. One of the best things, there was a shooting game where we were shooting at hypercubes. That was very cool. And another thing that interests me in virtual reality is dynamically interesting spaces. And here, this is where I've worked on those. I've worked on with cellular automata a lot. And in particular, I'm one of the few people that work with continuous valued cellular automata, which is where, like the game of life, you have 1 bit per pixel, but continuous valued cellular automata, you have a floating point number at each pixel. And it turns out the rule for the wave equation is actually a very simple rule. It's like you take the average of your neighbors and subtract your previous state. That's your update. And if you do that, you get waves like in water. And that's so much not a graphic issue, it's more of a computation issue, but I'm sure we could get Larry's cave to do this. I recently, again, as science fiction, I always like to take these things and do thought experiments of them in the science fictional world. So I recently actually wrote a story. There's been a million science fiction stories with virtual reality. It's almost like been done to death. So you have to come up with something new. In this story I wrote with Mark Laidlaw, it's actually on the cover of Isaac Asimov's. If you can find a story anywhere that still sells science fiction magazines, it's this month's issue. And this is the cover painting, it's very cool. And the reason those waves look weird is I was using a cubic nonlinear wave equation. So I got the artist to look at these simulations of waves that they don't look quite like real waves. Okay? So they have these cubic nonlinearities in them. And they have surfboards in the cave, and those are aquahaptic feedback devices that deal with the feeling that you're on the surf. And it's kind of a nice little story. It's called The Perfect Wave. Since it's a science fiction story, of course, the simulation gets loose and eats the universe. Another thing that interests me is bringing the real world into our simulations. And there's sort of this movement of locative art that you hear about. And the idea is affixing GPS points to things in the world and maybe overlaying computer graphics onto it or gluing together images of the world. That's a picture of the Gothic blimp works outside. And it's glued together from 4 or 5 little photos I took yesterday. And that's something that sort of interests me more than being in an airport lounge made of polygons. Now, in discussing cyberspace, we always have to get the word from the prophet, William Gibson, so there he is speaking pretty loud. And his recent book, Poop Country, Phil has this wonderful way of summarizing things. And he says, cyberspace has everted, or turned inside out. And once it everts, there isn't any cyberspace, is there? There never was, if you want to look at it that way. It was a way we had of looking where we were headed, a direction. With the grid, we're here. This is the other side of the screen. And the context where he's saying that, there are some locative artists, and they're doing things like, designing a giant squid in virtual reality and then having it be draped over the Transamerica building in San Francisco. So you can be wearing these special glasses, you walk down the street, you see the giant squid there, it's in your reality. So it's come out of the computer into your space. And that's something that is really interesting. It's an extreme form of when you go to a museum and you get an audio guide. And people have done that, artists. You walk around and you hear descriptions of what you're looking at, but it would be kicking it up a notch and projecting things over. Another thing that his artists do is, you can go to all the spots in Hollywood where famous stars died and see their corpses still there. It's the kind of thing the public likes. Another thing that's interested me a lot over the years is the idea of telepresence, but where you're in some way in control of the camera. And there's this dream of dragonfly cameras. There was even sort of a kind of a UFO thing about I think last fall. People claimed they were seeing dragonfly cameras watching the demonstrations that NASA had built them. haven't told anyone yet, which I'm sure NASA wishes that was true. But these are, it's this model of, the camera lens on your pocket digital camera is really small. So it'd be easy to make, and with charge-coupled devices, it'd be easy to make a really good camera that was, the size of your little finger, or even smaller. To give it wings. And so the dream is that you could have, again, you'd be sitting at home with your display, and you'd be driving this thing around, like the Mars rover, except you're using it like to see what's going on in the alleys of San Francisco, or one thing, whenever you go on a trip somewhere, you go on the web and you see pictures of the places you're going to stay, and everything looks nice, and then you go there and, oh, well, by the way, it's next to an iron smelter, or there's a prison next door, or, a dump, and you're never able to look around at will. And there are these things people have done, like Google has things where you can walk down the streets, but to have you be in control of the camera would be a big deal. And that's something I see coming online. And the way it'll work is there'll be racks of these dragonflies in various cities. And you can just dial up. You can rent one for an hour. You can fly it around. And you can look whenever you want to. It'll be somewhat of an issue. People will be like paparazzi kind of thing. There'll be a big swarm of them following Brittany. I don't know. It's kind of cool. I guess you have a bodyguard with a tennis racket. It's nice and proper. I talked about that a little bit in my novel. It's also wisdom. Now, the latest thing I'm into is a novel I just wrote called Post Singular. And actually, in a bold new marketing move, we decided to try giving away the book online as well as selling it. So if you go to that link, rudyrucker.com/postsingular, you can get a PDF of it and read it for free. Now, the idea I got into here was, what if we really totally everted cyberspace? And so the idea here was I had self-reproducing nanomachines that are called orphids. And that's sort of a pun on ARFID, radio frequency ID things, RFID. They self-reproduce, they just eat dust in the air, they're not destructive. And what about gray goo? Well, we're going to suppose that the orphids are territorial, they stay a certain distance from each other. They're going to cover Earth's surface, building down to 1 or 2 millimeters. So it's like in the Hollywood movies when you see the image where somebody discovers that he was living in a virtual reality, suddenly he sees the mesh under everything. We've got a mesh on everything, because there's these orphids all over anything. So you can, what's your interface? Well, we might as well assume they've landed on your skull and they're doing little tight magnetic coil type waves, and you've got the internet in your head. So you can essentially close your eye and see anything in the world, because everything is covered with this mesh. And the mesh is also velocity sensitive, so you can hear things, so you'll be able to see everything. Also, each orphid has memory, so they're going to store the past states. So you can see everything in the world all the time, forward and backwards. And how's that going to change society? Well, a lot. I mean, privacy's gone. And in a way, when I write science fiction, it's usually, in some sense, a metaphor. And this, in some sense, is a metaphor for our life right now. Privacy, I mean, what was the big deal about privacy? Who needed it? It's gone. She let herself see the dots on her fingers, the dots on her palms, dots all over her skin. The glowing vertices were connected by faint lines, with the lines forming triangles. A fine mesh of small triangles covered her knuckles. The coarser mesh spanned the back of her hand. The computational orphanet was going to have real-time articulated models of everything and everyone. And that's, maybe there's some questions about how it's going to be to live in that world, so I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You mentioned privacy not mattering. I'm curious about your thoughts on privacy and the current changes we're seeing in the world.
Well, it's actually, I was talking to Esther Dyson once, not too long ago, at the Accelerating Change Conference. And she had done this thing of making her medical records public. she said people are saying, well, that's the one thing I have to keep private is my medical records. And she said, I'm just going to make mine public. Why not? It's probably safer. And I'm a blogger. And if you get into being a blogger, then you begin to let go of a certain amount of privacy. Like, people tend to know what I'm doing. Like, I don't know, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people look at my blog every day. So they all know that I'm here giving this talk. And so am I worried that they're going to assassinate me? I was at first, but now, I've been blogging for a couple of years, and it doesn't look like it's going to. It's that good. It's the John Lennons they assassinated. They don't assassinate Ringo Starr.
Very good.
So it's you do. Of course, realistically, I don't put pictures of my family on the blog. Usually, you don't really. But I think it's a dialogue that is worth considering how important is privacy. And you might say, well, the government can find things out about you and persecute you. But if it's universal, the loss of privacy, then you know all the same bad things about them. I mean, the bad things that people do, there's like 4 or 5 bad things that people do. And everybody does them. And at some point, maybe we could be less of a Puritan, uptight society.
So you say you don't blog about your family. Do you ask people's permission if you blog about a conversation that you had with them?
Usually.
Some questions.
I mentioned in my talk that there's the wilderness sky, and there's some implications of that in terms of thought that I think a lot of people are unaware of in our society. I've spent a lot of my time out in the wilderness by myself, and nobody else's thoughts seemed to enter my mind. Nobody knew where I was, what I was doing, whether I lived or died. And what I've found in that sort of environment is that it gives you a freedom to examine things that you otherwise don't have in a space. I mean, as interesting and fascinating as it is to be in this room, there's a lot of thoughts in here that sort of influence how your own thoughts go.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm out in the blizzard in the mountains where nobody knows where I am, none of that is there. It's just my own thoughts. I've been accused of thinking outside the box, and I just say, what box? I mean, I'm thinking in a realm that is very different from the domain that most people are establishing their thoughts. And I think that that's why Walt Whitman said that we need wilderness behind civilization. We need to be able to get out, away, and think of things in a perspective. When I come back from wilderness to our society, and I think a lot of the astronauts have experienced this sort of thing, they're looking at things in a perspective that otherwise they don't have, or wouldn't have had.
Yeah, I very much relate to what you're saying. I also am somebody, I love to be out in the wilderness. And, or even like the bluffs in Santa Cruz, if you go up the coast. Yeah, I like that, I can lie on the ground and there's nobody around, nobody's going to say, are you all right? Yeah, I'm all right. I'm lying here, I'm thinking, okay? And there is sort of somewhat of a pressure to conform if you're in a group of people. So it's also very nice to get away from the web. Certainly in this world that I'm describing, it would be nice. You definitely would want to be able to turn off the internet in your head. You really do not want that on all the time, especially with the spam coming in while you're asleep. Spam dreams. So I think in the end, I sort of don't like computers. It's a thing of familiarity breeds contempt. I spent so much time with them in the last 20 years. If you look at watches, hardly anybody has a watch that has gears anymore. And I think in 100 years, you probably won't see very many computer chips. I think we're going to be using something different. I think the digital computers, they're so brittle, they're so tiresome. I think they're going to go away. And I think we're going to be using something different. If quantum computation pans out, the thing about quantum computation that most people don't quite realize yet is that essentially any physical object at all is a quantum computer. And, anything, a rock is carrying out, really a lot of universal computation. All we have is, there's a little bit of the input-output problem. Once we get that licked, you won't have these special things. Basically, any object you want will do some computing for you if you want it to. And actually, that's the theme I'm writing in the sequel to this book, Post-Singular. I'm writing a book called Hylozoic. And that's a legitimate Wikipedia word. It means the philosophical doctrine that everything is alive. And I'm writing about a world where somehow they've managed to provide a RAM upgrade to every atom in space. So all the objects have memory, and now somehow we've got the input-output problem solved. So essentially every object is acting like it's alive, and we can talk to it. And that's a strange idea. Whenever I tell it to people, there's this silence. It's sometimes I'm too far ahead of my time. But I think it's a cool idea. And the whole puzzle, the game in science fiction is to take a really strange idea and then put it into a world a virtual world, where you have romances, you have adventures, you have people trying to destroy the planet, you have people trying to save the planet. You've got, jokes, you've got art, you've got things happening, and you get it into a form where it's entertaining, and I usually don't know exactly where the book's going when I start. I outline, but I always end up being surprised at what happens. And that's because it's a thought experiment. I'm seeing what happens.
Wonderful thoughts, Rudy. In this post-privacy world, which my thoughts are pretty similar to yours on this, that privacy is a kind of a couple of century odd thing that developed once we had big cities a couple hundred years ago, and now it's going back to where we all lived in villages and there wasn't a privacy or wasn't about everybody. But it seems to me that NASA has a real opportunity to be a leader in looking over the horizon in this post-privacy world, because the astronauts, their bodies are monitored 24/7. They have, cameras everywhere. And if you think about going to the moon, going to Mars, you aren't in a private situation the way we would like to think we're in now. So maybe there's some actual research on the psychological and social outcomes of living in a total post-privacy world that NASA could focus on.
That's an interesting thought. I don't want to give the impression that I think it would be good to get rid of privacy. I'm more with the wilderness. If you've ever had children, when they're teenagers, you become very aware that they need their privacy. That's sort of what teenage rebellion is all about. And even with your spouse, it's like there's a level of intimacy where, did you tie your shoes? There's, you don't want to get that, So, it's a tricky thing, but it's just interesting to think about a world where it really is gone. Yeah, and then are there physiological effects? What's it going to lead to? That would be I had never thought about that, being an astronaut. That could get on your nerves, having a room full of 200 people watching everything you do.
I think the medical data of the astronauts is private.
Well, but there's a whole set of people on Earth, like the shuttle, is this whole vast array of people on Earth, and a couple of people up in the shuttle. And that community, everybody down on Earth is, in fact, knowing about that. Now, the fact that it's a limited community still means that your particular personal privacy isn't private to you anymore.
In fact, there are people who really want things about their medical condition. There are people who know more about your medical condition when you're an astronaut than you know. There are people watching your heart rate who know things that you're not aware of. So that's beyond privacy.
I often wish everyone knew about my medical condition. I have so many aches and pains.
Universal health care should open it up to everybody.
your novel, actually I've been looking at a few of your novels on Amazon Novel and some of the outlines of them, and find that a lot of science fiction has these amazing ideas, these creative, fascinating, interesting ideas, but most often they are centered around doom and destruction of some kind, This great idea which ultimately collapses to, the end of the world or the end of the species or war or something. Do you have any positive science fiction views of the future that you could summarize?
Well, one thing I see happening with the OrchidNet, I can tell you a lot. One thing that happens is people get this immense intelligence augmentation. And that's sort of, we've got that in a way already with Google. I mean, science fiction writers used to dream of the planetary computer that knew everything, and you could ask it a question, and it would give you the answer right away. And we have that. Right? It's just unbelievable. It just, and it just happens sort of without a noticing. And the thing that it still can't do for you, you can't spawn off processes. Like suppose I want to worry about my Social Security, or I want to worry about my insurance or something. It would be nice to just slave off a process that would go and do obsessive compulsive research on this, and tabulate everything, and then come up, with some reasonably good recommendation. Or if I want to know what should I do this afternoon instead of surfing over, I could just again slave off a process. Or even it could get more sophisticated. What should I put in my last chapter of my book, and I could clone off a couple of things somewhat similar to me that would write alternate versions if I could select them. So I think this is something that we'll see is sort of virtual agents that are going to be doing a lot of work for us in the web. And I think that might happen if we become telepathically linked. Really having telepathy, people with cell phones, they're very close to being telepathic. They're walking down the street, hearing voices and talking to people, and they're not crazy. And if you could get the cell phone, a little smaller, you could make it a pill that you take or something, and you could start getting other people to work, maybe share out. Here's something I'm thinking about. Can you help me with this? A little bit like a forum where you ask people questions and they give you answers. You're sort of making agents out of the world. So I see a lot of positive things coming in there, absolutely.
Yeah, hi. I come into this whole thing in, I'm a painter, I'm a paint artist who got into digital arts through 3D, and I end up in a big hotel at NASA, which is kind of cool. So I kind of came in here through the back door, or maybe even the trap door. And for me, a canvas is a 2D space, and then to take that into a computer environment puts another dimension, it puts a Z onto it, and it puts me into the 3D space. And we've been recently working with Google and using the time slider. And that allows you to commute in T, which puts 4D into the equation, which is utterly fascinating.
Were you saying you do a series of paintings and I can slide back and forth?
No. I started off as a painter.
Yeah.
We have an X and a Y.
Yeah.
So you then flop that into 3D Max or something like that, and you've got your Z and you can tessellate.
Yes.
And now you can put a time slider into Google Earth. It's what we do when we make the KMZ files, drop them into Google Earth.
Oh, I see.
And now you can be a TARDIS. You can whip through time backwards and forwards. And that now you're talking about shooting hypercubes, which takes into other dimensions. And I think it's really fascinating. I think that technologists are kind of boring people, and I think it takes people like yourself who make doodles of technology for other people to expand upon. And I think that science fiction is a genesis. It's a motive force in this process. It's very vital, and it's not frivolous. And I think the chuckles that you're breathing today are the wows of tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly. I don't understand why there isn't any good four-dimensional video game. There really should be. There's a recent digital movie, Flatland. Weirdly, there's two versions of Flatland came out in the same year. And they're sort of moving towards the idea of a four-dimensional movie, but it really is not, it wouldn't be that hard to do at this point. Thomas Banshoff at Brown University was an early person who did a lot of great visualization movies and hypercubes and other four-dimensional objects. So that's something I would really like to see. But that's all we're talking.
Let's thank Rudy.
Thank you very much for tuning into the special Biota podcast. Of course, Biota Live will go on at the usual time, Friday night Pacific, 8 p.m. And this coming week will be the Saturday matinee at 10 a.m. Pacific as well, in order to get folks on the East Coast and folks in Europe to contribute, possibly even call in live. Thank you very much for tuning into this podcast. Look forward to you tuning into the next podcast.